Currency Wars, the Domination of Financial Power, Part 2. When one speaks of 18th century Germany, what comes to mind is not a mighty empire, but a fragmented land, like an unfinished symphony, with hundreds of small, independent states. Fragmented territories and chaotic, entrenched power structures. Yet, amidst this chaotic tapestry, a financial bloodline began to drip, seeping into the soil, slowly forming what would become the axis of modern international banking. That foundation of power was sown by an unexpected family. Jews living in a ghetto in Frankfurt, known as Judengasse, the Jewish alley. They lived crammed in dilapidated houses, discriminated against, excluded from all echelons of power. But when the political doors closed, they entered through the financial crack. The one who laid the first stone for this financial empire was Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Initially just a trader of antique coins and precious artifacts, he understood one crucial truth. Power lay not in wealth itself, but in controlling its flow. He didn't seek to own gold, but rather to manage and circulate it for others. That was the seed of banking, not producing wealth, but manipulating every act that creates it. With a vision far ahead of his time, Mayer Rothschild didn't build a career as a merchant, but as an architect of anonymous power. He sent his 5 sons to 5 major financial centers of Europe, Frankfurt, London, Paris, and Vienna, creating a tightly linked network, trading internally with their own private cipher. No one outside the family understood it. It was the first global bank that needed no borders, no army, no flag. Their financial system was like a serpent at the bottom of the ocean, unseen by anyone. But every time it stirred, the whole world trembled. They didn't need to conquer land or wage war. Yet, they were the ones who determined the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Waterloo. Not just by tactical errors, but by a financial psychological blow from the Rothschilds. Information about Napoleon's defeat was spread by them on the London Stock Exchange before the British government could react, causing national bond prices to collapse. In a single day, they bought everything at rock-bottom prices. And the next day, when the official news of victory was announced, the Rothschild family's assets multiplied exponentially. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. What was more terrifying was that they not only manipulated war but also peace. They lent money to both sides to fight, then continued to lend money for reconstruction after the war. No battle occurred without them profiting, no defeat without them benefiting. Such a power needed no official title, for true power lay not on the throne, but behind it. Germany, fragmented into countless pieces, became the cradle for a stateless financial ideology. It was within this disintegration that the idea of a stateless bank found room to germinate. Unbound by state power, banking became a free entity. A fluid empire that could infiltrate every institution, every nation, every conflict. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, as Europe was engulfed in gunpowder smoke and devastation, the Rothschild family acted like conductors orchestrating that chaotic financial symphony. Currency was no longer merely a tool of exchange, but became a political weapon. And the wielders of that weapon were not emperors, but bankers in dark cloaks, speaking through bank windows and tapping out codes no one understood. They controlled information before the press even existed. They grasped political situations even before governments did. They moved assets at a speed horses couldn't match. And in that financial landscape, Germany was just a starting point. A laboratory where financial power was born, refined, and spread globally like a sweet virus. Throughout the 19th century, the financial empire of the Rothschild family expanded not only in breadth, but also in depth. They were no longer mere lenders, but became the hidden support for regimes, whether monarchical, republican, or dictatorial. Who ascended the throne or who was overthrown didn't matter. What mattered was whether that person could sign a debt agreement. One of their greatest achievements was manipulating war loans. A classic example was the enormous loan to the British government to counter Napoleon. The government couldn't raise such a sum from the populace in a short time, but the Rothschilds could. They established a swift, efficient, and most importantly, secret financial system. While war raged on battlefields, the real negotiations took place in bank offices. The world began to grow accustomed to a strange reality. A few banking families could save or sink an entire nation simply by loosening or tightening the credit spigot. The Rothschilds were the first prominent example, but not the last. Their success opened a path to power for other families like the Warburgs, Lehmans, and Lazard Freers. All learned from the transnational family banking model, placing blood ties above national laws. From the cramped alleys of Frankfurt, the Jewish banking network spread across Europe, not through war, not through colonial policy. They didn't seize land, they seized debt. They didn't use armies, they used interest rates. It was the softest, yet most ruthless exploitation ever invented, making a nation so desperate for money that it couldn't refuse any condition. One of the most terrifying aspects was that this system didn't need to reveal itself. It existed like a ghost, only appearing when a crisis erupted, when financial markets plunged into chaos, when currencies devalued, when the populace made mass withdrawals. That's when the bankers appeared as saviors, with bailout packages, emergency loans, and whispers tinged with destiny. A testament to that power was when the Rothschilds used their position to interfere in the elections of other nations. They didn't just fund candidates, they also adjusted the flow of money within the banking system to create a suitable market sentiment, thereby indirectly steering the public's votes. Democracy, in a sense, was outsourced to the financial oligarchs. If political power often came from the gun, financial power came from the bond. The subtle difference lay in the fact that a gun fires once and is done, while a bond could strangle an economy for decades. The holder of a gun instigates war, but the holder of a bond decides when a war begins and ends. 19th century Germany became a testing ground for modern banking models. It was no coincidence that colossal financial institutions like J.P. Morgan and Dresdner Bank were born there. But the deepest root, the largest shadow, remained the Rothschilds and their stateless ideology. It was this detachment from traditional political power that allowed them to operate as a supranational force. The story of Germany and international bankers is not a tale of the past. It is a prophecy, an echo that stretches into the 21st century. Because the model they created, family banking, transnational networks, informal power, still shapes the world we live in. Only the names have changed today, but the operating principles remain the same. To control money is to control people, and to control debt is to control the future. People can argue about ideologies, about capitalism or socialism. But all of that stands behind one thing, the flow of currency. And the first chapter in that history of control was in Frankfurt, in a cramped alley, where a Jewish coin dealer understood that the future lay not in guns, but in ledgers of debt. If Germany was the cradle where financial tycoons were born, then England was the grand stage where their power was performed with mastery, cold precision, and artistry. Here, power didn't come from armies, nor from the throne, but from a seemingly ordinary street. The city, a city within London, yet not truly belonging to it. That city had no guards, no walls, yet it was the most impenetrable financial fortress in the world. Every transaction, large or small, every loan and public debt, flowed like blood through the arteries of the city. Here, the Bank of England, founded in 1694, was established not to serve the people, but to serve a more discreet power, the private bankers. The story began with a sweet trap called the war loan. When King William III needed money to wage war against France, he couldn't print money himself without devaluing the pound. So a group of merchants, known as the Company of Merchants, proposed a deal. They would lend the king £1.2 million in exchange for the right to establish a bank that could issue paper money and collect interest on this loan. Thus, the central bank was born, not as a national institution, but as a miracle of profit for the financial elite. From its very inception, the Bank of England did not belong to the state. It was a private enterprise cloaked in public authority. What was remarkable was its power to issue paper money, a privilege previously held only by monarchs. And when a private institution could print money, the world entered an entirely new era, the era of unofficial power. From then on, London was not just the political capital of the empire, on which the sun never set, but also the financial capital that manipulated every corner of the colonial world. While bullets and guns conquered India, Africa, and the Middle East, the flow of money from the City of London surged everywhere like an irresistible tide. The genius of the British lay not in occupation, but in control without presence. They let nations manage their own state apparatus, tax their own people, collect their own budgets, and then lent them that very money, so the nation would pay its own debts with its own funds. but at interest rates decided by London, a pinnacle of indirect control where Britain didn't need to rule to be king. In that model, the nation was not the subject, but merely the perpetual debtor. And once a debtor, it was no different from being shackled, even if clad in golden armor. But the City of London was not just a concrete block filled with banks. It was a special territory, with its own laws, its own government, even its own festivals for the financial elite. Mysterious traditions like the Lord Mayor's show or the dragon symbols guarding the city gates were not just customs. They were rituals of ancient power reenacted in modern form. The banks in the city were not ordinary institutions. They operated like clandestine state corporations, capable of influencing global markets with a mere rumor, a statement, or an interest rate adjustment. And when the City of London sneezed, Wall Street reached for a tissue. Yet, the strangest thing was that throughout this process, the British people were never consulted. They didn't vote on the establishment of the central bank, nor were they informed of its true ownership structure. Those who questioned were often forgotten by history or depicted as delusional, undermining market stability. But whose stability was the market providing? In truth, every nation that entered the financial vortex created by the City of London paid a price. Whether in the short or long term, while Britain itself seemed immune because they not only set up the game, but also dictated the rules and controlled the referee. That wasn't just power. It was the art of ruling in the shadows. The 19th century witnessed the unprecedented expansion of the British Empire. But what was more remarkable was that Britain's financial system spread even deeper and wider than its colonial map. Through investment banks, satellite central banks, and public debt systems, they not only controlled governments, but also manipulated local merchants, landowners, and even religious clergy. Imagine you are a newly independent nation. You need money to build infrastructure, train civil servants, establish an army. But you can't print it yourself without causing hyperinflation. You also don't have an efficient tax system. So, whom do you turn to? The city, which will lend you money. But on condition that you open your markets, liberalize capital flows, and most importantly, maintain your currency on the gold standard or pegged to the British pound. From then on, you lose the right to adjust monetary policy, and your nation becomes a financial satellite. In financial language, the City of London doesn't speak of subjugation, it speaks of market stability. It doesn't discuss enslavement, it discusses liquidity. But behind these seemingly harmless terms lies comprehensive control over the economic life of an entire people. You can do nothing if money doesn't flow in, and money won't flow if you don't comply with their conditions. Besides the central bank, institutions like Barings Bank, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, later HSBC, were also extended arms of British financial power. Barings once financed both the Napoleonic Wars and railway projects in Latin America. A private bank that could deal with kings and presidents as equals. That was no longer just finance, that was raw power. Another unique aspect of Britain was its acceptance of controlled risk. They allowed banks to invest venturesome everywhere, yet maintained an invisible limit to prevent the entire system from collapsing. If a crisis occurred, the central bank would step in to rescue it with taxpayer money. This created a painful paradox. The risk was private, but the consequences were public. The British never fully disclosed the true workings of their financial system. Everything was wrapped in a cloak of transparency, but that cloak was merely a curtain. Behind it lay a tangled structure of familial interests, lobby groups, and ancient ciphers. Many old documents were even sealed by the state, citing national security, even if they only concerned stock transactions from centuries ago. But what made the City of London the pinnacle of financial power was not just its scale or influence, but its survival through every historical upheaval. World wars, the collapse of the British Empire, oil crises, dot-com bubbles, and the 2008 global financial crisis. It didn't die. It merely transformed like a colossal octopus. When one tentacle was severed, it regrew and then some. The city didn't need to be loved, it only needed to be feared and depended upon. This created a silent, non-threatening, bloodless form of power, yet capable of bankrupting an entire nation with a mere exchange rate adjustment or a single statement from the governor of the central bank. The ultimate question always remained: who truly controlled the City of London? No one knew for sure, and perhaps no one should, because when people looked too deeply into that core of power, they would understand that the world didn't operate on reason, but on debt. And the place that invented the most sophisticated forms of debt was England. If Germany was the cradle where financial players were born, and England was the arena where they performed, then France was like an isolated fortress. A place where financial powers quietly built their ramparts, shunning public scrutiny yet controlling the fate of the nation. There, finance wasn't a profession, but an aristocratic bloodline, blending commercial cunning with a French artistic sensibility. 19th century France was not the strongest financial empire, but it was the fastest developing hub for private, family banks, especially those linked to the old aristocracy. While other nations gradually professionalized their financial systems, in France, financial power still bore the imprint of landowners and the traditional elite. It was fertile ground for families like the French Rothschilds, brothers of the Rothschild lines in Germany and England, to evolve into an independent force. What made France unique was how the financial elite and the ruling class coexisted in parallel, yet never truly overlapped. Presidents could change, prime ministers could be replaced, but the bankers remained seated in their ancient stone mansions, holding closed-door meetings on sunless afternoons. In those meetings, they didn't discuss politics, but interest rates, exchange rates, and the ability to control markets through a network of cascading debt. Just like in England, the Bank of France was established to serve the interests of its owners, not the people. But in France, the sophistication lay in the fact that the bank issued money not according to state needs, but according to the needs of other banks. This meant a very small group could decide where money would flow, who would be rescued, and who would go bankrupt. That was the power of life and death in a market economy, yet held by a group of anonymous gentlemen. France didn't need to expand its financial system globally like Britain or America. They only needed to protect their sphere of influence, especially in Africa and Indochina. There, French banks not only served as financiers, but also managed entire tax systems, issued local currencies, and even controlled the salaries of indigenous civil servants. In essence, they established parallel financial governments, parasitic on the actual administrations. In the post-revolutionary era, France experienced continuous political upheaval, from empire to republic and then to empire again. But no matter how the regime changed, the financial structure remained constant. This led people to realize that politics was merely a seasonal mask. The true faces governing France were still names outside parliament, beyond public opinion, outside official history. The most striking event demonstrating this was during the era of Napoleon III, when France undertook a series of industrialization and urbanization projects. Most of the investment came from private banks, with sky-high interest rates and strict repayment terms. If the state couldn't pay on time, the banks would automatically cut off funding and buy back state shares in public utility companies. From then on, electricity, water, railways, telecommunications all gradually fell into private hands. But not ordinary private hands, but groups of financial magnates with networks spanning across Europe. With an artist's instinct and an innate ability for staging, the French didn't need to flaunt financial power like the British. They didn't build a Wall Street, didn't organize lavish financial festivals. Instead, they hid their power within family banks, in mahogany meeting rooms, where there were no loudspeakers, yet every decision made carried the weight of a declaration of war. France was also one of the pioneering nations in using finance as a tool of soft cultural and political power in colonies like Algeria or Vietnam. French banks didn't merely lend or control cash flow. They also acted as economic teachers, imposing accounting standards, credit models, and even methods of budget management. From this, a generation of indigenous intellectuals was trained in French financial thinking, both revering French civilization and dependent on loans that were never enough to fully repay. But this created a bitter paradox. While France preached values of freedom, democracy, and fraternity, French banks operated based on dependence, opacity, and inevitability. They funded an economy they knew would never mature enough to escape their grasp. A type of creditor-debtor relationship so cunning that the debtor didn't even feel bound. Another unique trait of France lay in its ability to sustain multiple parallel financial centers. Unlike England, Where financial power was concentrated in the city of London, in France, power was more dispersed. Paris was the main center, but Lyon, Bordeaux, and Marseille also had distinct financial flows held by local interest groups. This made France like a multi-layered financial matrix, overall stable yet very susceptible to internal manipulation. In modern history, the imprints of French financial power were not as dazzling as Wall Street or the City of London, but they subtly permeated the roots of former colonial nations. Strange credit mechanisms, 99-year term debts, preferential investment regulations exclusively for French companies. All were legacies of the era when banks controlled nations. If there's an image to describe France in the global financial game, it's an aristocrat in white gloves standing in the shadows, smiling as they observe the chessboard, never needing to step forward, never needing to make a sound. Yet every move bore their mark. While other nations built power with steel, money, or technology, France built it with silence and contracts. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is that when power is encased in beauty, people accept it more readily. France transformed banking into something that couldn't be hated because it didn't bear the appearance of a mafia boss, but rather an art patron. A wealthy father with a soft scarf around his neck, but beneath that scarf, a hand gripped tighter than any chain. Like Britain, France couldn't control the entire world, but they didn't need to. What the French financial elite understood was that by controlling just a few key institutions, central banks, insurance companies, credit-issuing agencies, the rest would automatically follow like dominoes. And wherever there was instability, they appeared not as aggressors, but as strategic investors. Chapter 3 closed like a reverse mirror. No need for many guns and bullets, no need for dollars or pounds sterling, just contracts and numbers. And then one day, you realize your country and all your dreams have been valued, mortgaged, and resold long ago. In a room in Paris, among well-dressed men, speaking in low tones and drinking unsweetened coffee. If Germany was the birthplace of financial players, England the stage for their performance, and France a proud fortress, then America, strangely, began its financial journey as an outsider. Initially, they weren't invited to the banquet of power, but somehow they didn't just get a seat. They became the ones who cleared the table, chose the dishes, and ultimately rewrote the menu for the entire world. Founding-era America was a new land with old ambitions, absolute freedom. But financial freedom was something dangerous, especially without control. The Founding Fathers, from Jefferson to Hamilton, fiercely debated whether a new nation should establish a central bank. Hamilton supported it, believing a national bank would stabilize the economy. Jefferson vehemently opposed it, arguing that a powerful central bank would be a new form of tyranny. Initially, history sided with Jefferson. The first Bank of the United States, America's first central bank, closed after just 20 years. But then successive financial crises occurred, and like every storm in financial history, their aftermath created gradual acceptance. People were willing to sacrifice freedom for a sense of security. Finally, in 1913, amidst conspiracies, negotiations, and secret meetings on Jekyll Island, an institution was born that remains, to this day, both the heart and the tumor of the global financial system, the United States Federal Reserve System. The strange thing is that despite its national-sounding name, the Fed doesn't belong to the government. It's a syndicate of private banks with the power to issue currency and regulate interest rates. In other words, a group of unelected shareholders controlled the bloodstream of the entire U.S. economy. The birth of the Fed didn't come from democratic demand, but from fear, the fear of crises like the Panic of 1907. When the stock market crashed, numerous banks failed, and people queued for blocks to withdraw their money. While the government was powerless, the only figure who could save the market was an individual, J.P. Morgan. He personally raised capital, forced banks to merge, and calmed the market with his personal prestige. But a system where an individual could save a nation was an unstable system. So the Fed was born as a perpetual J.P. Morgan, but without the Morgan name, wearing a mask of public authority to win over the people. And from then on, the U.S. dollar was no longer merely a national currency, but a global financial instrument, coordinated by a small, anonymous group living in the shadows and protected by law. The genius, or the danger, of the Fed lay in this. It was designed to be both like the government and not the government. The president has the power to appoint the Fed chair, but cannot interfere with monetary policy decisions. Congress can summon the Fed for questioning, but has no power to fire members of the Board of Governors. This means the Fed holds supreme power but is not accountable to the people. A bizarre design, yet incredibly effective if you're a banker. And it was effective indeed. Within decades of its creation, the Fed helped the U.S. overcome the Great Depression, though partly caused by them, financed 2 world wars, and most importantly, transformed the dollar from a national currency into the global reserve currency. That was the greatest leap for a currency in human history. From a piece of paper printed in Washington, it became the passport for all global economic activity. After World War II, the U.S. became the planet's largest creditor. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, as devastated nations sought a path to recovery, the U.S. proposed a solution: building an international financial system based on the dollar, with the commitment that 1 ounce of gold equaled $35, and the Fed would guarantee this rate. Countries no longer needed to hoard gold, only dollars. Initially, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but over time, people realized a strange thing. The U.S. was the only country with the right to print debt to buy real assets. They printed dollars, used them to buy goods, invest, build armies. Then other countries held dollars as a form of paper gold, but no one knew for sure what was inside. And when countries began to doubt and wanted to exchange dollars for gold as promised, in 1971, President Nixon announced the end of dollar-to-gold convertibility, kicking the gold standard away. From then on, paper money became a superweapon. The U.S. thus controlled the world not through warships or missiles, but through a global financial system with the Fed as the central pump and Wall Street as the trading stage. They could punish any nation simply by freezing assets, sanctioning banks, or withdrawing investments. They could devalue a nation's currency in days, toppling governments without a single shot. The terrifying thing is that the U.S. isn't alone in this. Major banks like Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and Citigroup, though private, have an organic relationship with the state. Bank executives rotate into the Treasury Department, the Fed, or global organizations like the IMF and World Bank, then return to the market with doubled power. People call it the revolving door, but in reality, it's a gateway to a world where the state and finance are no longer distinct. The U.S. did what previous empires only dreamed of: exporting debt instead of weapons. They didn't need to occupy, didn't need to plant flags. As long as you used the dollar, you were under their control. And if you used another currency, they would force you back through markets, economic stability, international organizations, and finally, if necessary, through war. So America wasn't an outsider. They were the biggest insider, the ultimate player in a game where victory lay not in territory, but in the power to issue money. And the holders of that power were none other than the true masters sitting within the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors, behind soundproof doors in Washington, where there was no national flag, no constitution, only balance sheets and decisions that could shake the entire planet. There was once a Europe that dreamed. If only it could set aside centuries of wars, borders, and bloody hatreds, that land would become a prosperous paradise, where people moved freely, goods flowed smoothly, and currency was a common language. They called that dream the European Union, and its heart was the euro. But Europe was not a smooth machine. It was like a vehicle assembled from incompatible fragments. France was not like Germany, Spain not like the Netherlands, Italy not like Belgium. And in trying to unite these elements with a common currency, they created a paradox: common money but no common budget, common risk but no common control. Initially, the euro seemed like a miracle. European nations could borrow money at unprecedentedly low interest rates. Thanks to Germany's financial credibility, international investors poured money into Greece, Portugal, Ireland as if they were mini Berlins. But the reality was far different. These nations spent like billionaires but taxed like peasants. When the bubble burst, all eyes turned to Germany, where no one wanted to pay anyone else's debts. The sovereign debt crisis began to simmer in Greece, spreading to Ireland, then Spain, Italy, and even France. Nations once highly credit-rated suddenly became global debtors, their fates assessed by private rating agencies. Unfamiliar names from New York, yet holding the power to decide the destiny of tens of millions of Europeans. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank, ECB, was fumbling like a giant without arms. They could print money but couldn't force governments to increase revenue or cut spending. They could lower interest rates but couldn't solve unemployment or stagnation. A central bank constrained by 27 governments, each government constrained by local votes. That was no longer monetary policy, it was political survival art. And when chaos reached its peak, familiar faces reappeared. The IMF, ECB, and European Commission, playing the role of a stern triumvirate, offering bailout packages with harsh conditions. Cut public spending, raise taxes, privatize everything that could be sold. In other words, selling the future cheaply to pay for the past. Greece was the most painful example. The nation where democracy was born now became a laboratory for the harshest experiments of global finance. People lost jobs, pensions were cut, hospitals lacked medicine, schools closed, yet financial markets stabilized, the euro held its value, and German banks collected profits. The problem lay in the fact that the euro is a currency without a sovereign nation. It's not tied to a single government, has no central finance ministry, no common tax system. The euro is a technical product placed in a divided political context. And that's what made it easy prey for the very forces that had once sown financial storms on other continents. In the shadows of government bond trading floors, major players like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, and several international hedge funds manipulated the value of European debt instruments as if playing poker. If a nation seemed timid, they would drive down bond prices, forcing interest rates up, compelling that nation to seek a bailout package. Then, when the bailout was greenlit, they would buy those bonds at rock-bottom prices, profiting twice from the suffering of an entire people. Some analysts once believed that the European sovereign debt crisis was an inevitable consequence of a union lacking consensus. But if we look deeper, we see it was not just a consequence, but also a tool to redistribute financial power within Europe. Smaller nations were forced to surrender control of their budgets in exchange for financial stability. But where did that stability come from? From supranational financial institutions, where power was concentrated but responsibility was diffused. Like a great flood, the crisis revealed the true skeleton of power. Anonymous players within transnational banking systems, unelected institutions that could compel elected governments to cut healthcare, education, and even school meals. Behind every word restructuring were thousands of lives disrupted. Behind every market stabilization was an entire generation losing its way. And at the center of it all was Germany. Unlike the Weimar era, 21st century Germany didn't need tanks to expand its influence. They possessed a stronger weapon, financial credibility. As long as Germany nodded, other nations could access capital. If Germany shook its head, the Eurozone could fall into recession. This made Germany the nerve center of Europe, a center that didn't need to speak much, but every word carried absolute weight. Thus, the cynical saying in financial circles, the European Union is a democratic model, but its budget is a German-style dictatorship. Not because Germany imposed the rules, but because no one else was strong enough to object in the long run. This pushed Europe into a peculiar state, wealthy but unstable, civilized but lacking autonomy. Nations, despite having modern economies and good welfare systems, were being manipulated by macroeconomic indicators largely written by global financial institutions. And in all this chaos, one important thing was rarely mentioned. Economic democracy cannot exist if monetary decisions do not belong to the people. When you cannot elect those who decide interest rates, when you cannot question who authorized the cheap sale of national assets, then that democracy is merely formal. Europe didn't collapse, but it slowly melted away, not by bullets but by interest rates, not by war but by the burden of public debt. And while nations reeled from elections, true power remained in the hands of those behind screens, watching every curve of the chart. They carry no guns, but can paralyze an entire nation with a decision from the ECB. They don't show their faces, but they control governments through loan conditions. They are the modern kings, without thrones, but with the power to decide who survives a crisis. Europe thought it was leading the world with intellect and culture, but after the debt crisis, they realized, Whoever controls the money controls all dreams. Hitler didn't begin his career with money, he began with humiliation. Specifically, the humiliation of a defeated nation, tied down by the Treaty of Versailles and drained by unimaginable war reparations. Post-war Germany's economy was a walking corpse, the mark plummeted in value, inflation soared off every chart. People brought wheelbarrows of money to the market but couldn't buy a loaf of bread. In such a world, who could speak of economics? Not a scholar, but a fortune-teller. And then he came. Unlike the usual image of a warmongering dictator, Hitler entered history not just with a megaphone, but with an economic playbook so bizarre it was dangerous. He understood one thing that neither international financiers nor academic scholars of the time wanted to touch. Money is not gold. Money is belief. And belief can be created if you have the right script and actors. Hitler's new economic policy followed no classical rules. It was a mixture of populism, market manipulation, and a complete rejection of the monetary principles of the gold standard era. The first thing the Nazi regime did was not borrow or raise taxes, but create money without going through the central bank. They established an organization called MEFO, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, a paper company with no employees, no office, but with the power to issue bills to finance the defense industry. These bills were not sold on the market, but used for internal payments between contractors and the government, a temporary form of money, yet fully liquid because everyone knew the government stood behind it and war was coming. It was a brilliant circumvention of the traditional banking system, where other nations had to beg international bankers for money to run their countries. Hitler didn't beg. He created a second financial system, secret, discreet, but operating powerfully like a heart beating outside the body. As the German economy made a miraculous recovery, unemployment dropped from 30% to below 5% in just a few years. The whole world was amazed, but they didn't understand. It wasn't a revival, it was a prelude to an explosion. Hitler didn't rescue the economy with market confidence. He used fiscal policy like a mad drummer, increasing public spending without limit on infrastructure, military, manufacturing, all bypassing the central banking system. He transformed the entire economy into a war machine, wrapped in a veneer of growth. And if any other nation had done that, the global financial system would have punished it immediately. Loss of credit rating, skyrocketing interest rates, investor withdrawals. But the strange thing was, with Nazi Germany, no one did anything because many major banks in Britain, America, and Switzerland, names you hear every day, were indirectly investing in Germany's defense industry. They didn't like Hitler, but they liked money, and when money multiplied quickly, they turned a blind eye to the scent of blood. Hitler's policy wasn't just reckless, it was a direct slap in the face of international finance. While other nations were still kneeling before outdated economic dogmas, begging the IMF for aid or struggling with war debts, Nazi Germany simply ignored the rules. They created their own rulebook, closed their doors, poured money into guns and roads, and made the world look at them as a model of rebirth. But the price for that German miracle didn't lie in the growth figures. It lay in the fact that it couldn't last without war. That economy, that monetary system, could only survive if fueled by expansion. Without war, that colossal sum of money would never be recouped. And if you couldn't repay your debts, the only remaining way was to seize the assets of others. Therefore, World War II was not just the consequence of fascist ideology or extreme nationalism. It was the logical outcome of a financial system programmed to explode. Everything in the German economy aimed at a single point: expansion. Endless autobahns, newly built trains, weapons factories operating 24/7. None were born for peace, they were born for conquest. And when war broke out, the banking system Hitler himself built operated smoothly like a deadly industrial production line. Everything had been prepared beforehand. MEFO bills transformed into war financing tools. Quietly nationalized banks cooperated with the Ministry of Defense. Industrial magnates became strategic partners of the totalitarian state. But the most horrifying paradox was that the whole world saw it and remained silent, because behind the condemning speeches, many Western nations were still doing business with Germany. IBM provided punch card machines to manage population and filter Jews. Chase Manhattan Bank and other big names quietly maintained credit lines for German companies operating abroad. Here, morality was valued and sold according to the exchange rate table. And after all, when Germany was defeated, they didn't dismantle the Nazi financial system. They restructured it, changed names, changed faces, kept useful figures, and placed them in strategic positions within the post-war banking system. That wasn't justice. That was reinvestment after losses. Hitler fell, but many of his economic ideas lived on. Today, when a nation prints money not based on gold, when public spending is used to stimulate growth despite deficits, when undemocratic financial institutions dictate monetary policy by command, we are treading the very paths that Nazi Germany once opened. Of course, no one calls it financial fascism. They call it demand-side stimulus, system stabilization, macroeconomic risk management. But the essence isn't in the name, the essence is in control. Who can create money? Who decides where that money flows, and who will pay the debt when the model collapses? That question isn't in economic textbooks, but it's the only one worth asking if we still care about freedom beneath the sweet veneer of growth. When war rages, people usually look at guns and bullets, maps and generals. But sometimes, what determines victory or defeat lies in a bank statement or a 3-minute phone call between a bank president and an intelligence chief. On the surface, banking and intelligence seem unrelated. One deals with ledgers, currencies, accounts, the other with infiltration, assassination, and double agents. But precisely because they seem unrelated, their alliance becomes unpredictable, like a conductor shaking hands with a horror film director. You never know what the next tune will be. In the 20th century, the rise of international bankers was inseparable from transnational intelligence networks. Financial families like the Rothschilds and Warburgs not only had political connections, but also maintained secret communication channels with top intelligence agencies. This is not speculation. This is reality hidden behind national security barriers. Take, for example, the shining star of this network, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. Established with the simple reason of coordinating war reparations for Germany after World War I, the BIS was in essence where central bankers met periodically, exchanged information, and built trust. This trust was not for the public, but for each other, to know that when a nation collapsed, their money would still be safe. Throughout World War II, the BIS remained operational, even as European nations were in a state of total war. The Nazi German central bank transferred assets through it. The Bank of England still sent reports. The U.S. Federal Reserve still received interest. No one was surprised, because money in the space of the BIS had no borders. But it didn't stop at money. It was these secret meetings among bankers at the BIS that became informal communication channels for intelligence networks. They shared data but also probed strategies. Sometimes, a report on monetary stability contained information about troop deployments, reserves of precious metals, and signs of political instability. And these financial magnates were not just information providers, they also received assignments. Throughout the Cold War, many banks became tools for covert operations, financing coups, providing financial cover for spies, or using subsidiaries to launder money for friendly factions. The entire process was so sophisticated that a bank could operate as an intelligence hub without needing agents. Behind the cold stone doors of bank headquarters in Geneva, Zurich, New York, or London, there weren't just old accountants. These were strategic coordination rooms where information and currency were exchanged like poker chips. Every click of a transfer was not just a financial transaction, but a political act, a silent message sent to a clandestine ally or a warning to an adversary preparing to make a move. Bankers knew this well. They didn't carry guns, but they decided who guns would be sold to, at what time, and through what channels. Aid items that an intelligence agency provided to rebels in Africa didn't arrive directly by military plane, but via intermediary banks in the Middle East, anonymous accounts in the Caribbean, and legitimized through law firms on Park Avenue. Conversely, when a regime began to lose control, the sign wasn't falling flags or gunfire, but money starting to flow backward. Politicians transferred assets abroad. International banks began freezing credit lines, financial institutions refused to guarantee contracts. That's how financial intelligence says, the game is over. And the cruel truth is that in that world, there are no friends, no foes, only who the remaining party is. The person a bank financed yesterday could be betrayed today. High-ranking leaders of overthrown nations were often stunned to find their assets frozen, not because they committed crimes, but because they no longer held a strategic role on the chessboard. How could bankers delve so deeply into things seemingly unrelated to them? Coups, politics, war, intelligence? The answer lies in a paradox. When everything becomes too complicated, people will trust whoever controls the pulse of money. And at that very moment, the bank becomes an irreplaceable power, even though no one elected it and no one has the right to depose it. The author recounts a story of an international financier at a private party, whispering to a European politician, "We can collapse your country's economy in 2 weeks if you don't agree to our debt restructuring terms." That wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. A truth like a knife, no need to raise one's voice, just gently placed on the table. We are not to draw conclusions, because the network between banking and intelligence itself is inconclusive. It's like a hall of mirrors. The deeper you go, the more repeating reflections you see. The more you analyze, the more ambiguous it becomes. You cannot pinpoint who is at the center, who orders whom, who is whose tool. Because in that world, the banker is also a spy, and the spy is also an investor. And perhaps what makes people tremble is not the nature of that power itself, but the way it has maintained absolute silence for centuries. No emblems, no flags, no slogans, only numbers, networks, loans, and debts. Until one day you realize your nation, its stability, even the very definition of national security, are all calculated by interest rates set by someone, from an unnamed building. People still believe that democratic institutions are the ultimate achievement of social progress. But in this chapter, we are forced to confront a more uncomfortable question. Is there something operating parallel to democracy that the public is entirely unaware of? Not a Hollywood-style shadow government, but a form of post-legislative power, where policy is shaped before it's ever publicly debated. Giant financial capital groups, multi-generational family trusts, unlisted banks powerful enough to rescue an entire government from default or push it towards one if necessary. These people don't need to declare power because they don't have to fight for it. They were born with it, and most of the world accepts that without a shred of doubt. When a nation falls into crisis, the IMF is called in like an emergency doctor. But very few ask, who controls the IMF? Who writes the prescription? Who benefits from the restructuring process? The answer lies in unrecorded meetings, where terms are set before the public has a chance to protest. And if protests do occur, the media, largely controlled by financial corporations, will describe them as riots, ignorance, or incitement. The modern world gives you the feeling that you are chosen, that you elect members of parliament, presidents, markets. But few ask what real power those individuals possess within the global financial system. Can a finance minister command the central bank? Can a president refuse to pay bond debts? Or are they merely gatekeepers, maintaining order, ensuring the game proceeds smoothly? The invisible oligarchy doesn't operate with guns, they operate with legitimacy. Everything is written in the language of law, minutes, contracts, making any act of resistance a breach of procedure. And in that world, whoever controls the definition of procedure is the one who rewrites the future. The sophistication of the oligarchy lies in their not needing to give orders. They create conditions for everyone to walk in the right direction, like an invisible architect. They design the playing field, set the boundaries, and then step aside, leaving democratically elected governments floundering in a labyrinth of budgets, interest rates, credit ratings, and bailout packages booby-trapped with impossible terms. Dare we admit that those who truly run the world are not on the stage? And if we do admit it, what will we do with that truth? Perhaps the hardest pill to swallow is not the existence of the invisible oligarchy, but the fact that most of us, deep down, have unconsciously accepted them as an inevitability like a type of weather. Sunny days, rainy days, central banks, family investment funds, presidents, and those who finance them. 2008 wasn't just a massive collapse, it was a tsunami. It didn't originate from the coast but from our trust. A monetary tsunami didn't sweep away houses, but swept away faith in a system that seemed more solid than concrete, the global financial market. Everything began as a local fever. Housing prices in the US rose absurdly fast. Mortgages were handed out as easily as flyers. But instead of seeing this as an alarm signal, banks seized the opportunity to create a shell game, transforming bad debt into investment products, bundling, securitizing, rating it AAA and selling it off, then bundling again, securitizing again, rating again. From an apartment of a black couple in Detroit, a chain of dominoes was replicated, and replicated. When the bubble burst, the first to collapse weren't the borrowers, but the giant institutions behind them, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG. And then, like the tide receding after an earthquake, the whole world saw that these financial giants were, in fact, naked. Who designed that complex credit structure? Who authorized the investment banking system to bypass regulations? Who assigned AAA ratings to toxic debt products? And why, when everything unraveled, were the leaders of the financial industry not prosecuted but bailout out with taxpayer money? The answer isn't in accounting ledgers. It lies in the nature of the power relationship between government and finance. And in that relationship, the government isn't the controller, it's the hostage. A financial crisis is like a forest fire where the arsonists are also the sellers of firefighting equipment. Big banks created the bubble, sold risky products. When everything collapsed, they were the first to be rescued because they were too big to fail. A phrase that seemed like a justification was, in fact, a coercion. If they weren't saved, the entire system would collapse. But if they were saved, no one had any reason to change their behavior. The greatest irony of the 2008 financial crisis wasn't in the evaporated numbers. It was in the resurrection of those who caused the disaster, with even greater scale and power than before. After being pumped with bailout money by the government, banks not only didn't shrink their operations but proceeded to merge, acquiring weaker rivals, transforming themselves into megabanks, too big to be prosecuted, too complex to be understood, and too important to be toppled. People lost homes, pension funds evaporated, trust shattered. Meanwhile, bank executives still received multi-million-dollar bonuses as if they had just won an internal golf tournament. But who dared speak up? The press system, dependent on financial advertising, mildly described it as a necessary adjustment, a temporary phase of the economic cycle. The question was thoroughly avoided. Was this truly a crisis or a deliberate harvest? Look at investment funds that bet against the mortgage market, like Goldman Sachs. While advising clients to buy risky CDO products, they secretly bet that those products would fail. And when everything exploded, they won big. Afterward, they were again pumped with taxpayer money to stabilize the system. That wasn't a market. That was an invisible, assumed hand programmed to break the real hand. The 2008 crisis also revealed a cruel reality. Currency was no longer a medium of exchange. It was a tool for restructuring power. Nations labeled with financial risk were forced to concede policy. Governments whose credit ratings were downgraded could no longer govern without technocratic solutions from the IMF, ECB, or foreign experts. This meant the crisis didn't collapse global financial capitalism, but helped it penetrate deeper into the political structure of each country. Decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people were made by a few dozen individuals, unelected, unaccountable, and facing no consequences if wrong. So what lay behind the tsunami? Not a system error, not a technical glitch, but a model that had reached its ethical limit yet retained its profitability for those who controlled it. And precisely for this reason, it didn't need to change. It just needed another round of money printing, another stimulus package, another interest rate cut. Crisis, therefore, was no longer a surprise. It was a rhythm like a sine wave. Growth, bubble, collapse, bailout, restructuring, growth again. People called it a cycle. But if you're always the one losing in each cycle, you're not a participant, you're fuel. We weren't defeated because we were foolish, but because we believed too strongly that the rules of the game were real. And while those who designed the chessboard were dining together at a secluded resort, we were still arguing about who should be the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. As if that would truly change anything. The future, a word always pronounced with eyes looking forward, but in reality, it's often decided by things that happened long ago, behind us. The final chapter of this book is not a prophecy, but a look back, to make us understand that what is coming has, in fact, been arranged beforehand by people we never elected, in rooms we were never allowed to enter. Song Hongbing didn't draw the future with charts. He didn't speak of growth rates, economic cycles, or inflation. Instead, he asked a terrifying question. When the global monetary system is built like a labyrinth with no exit, what happens when all dead ends collapse simultaneously? He stripped away the final mask of money, no longer just a medium of exchange, nor a symbol of national power. Money, according to him, had transformed into a floating ideology, belonging to no one, bearing no nationality, yet capable of compelling the entire world to submit. The current global financial order, he argued, is maintained not by real economic strength, but by the deliberate repetition of crises. Each time a bubble bursts, the fragments are collected, mixed, repackaged into new products, and launched onto the market with labels of financial innovation. Buyers don't know, sometimes governments don't even know, that they are holding an improved version of the very thing that once plunged the economy into the abyss. If the past is an old play restaged with new actors, then the future, as Song Hongbing described, is a theater without an audience. Because in that future, everyone is an unwilling actor in a play whose script they don't know. There is a silent but undeniable truth. The current global financial system operates not on trust, but on a lack of alternatives. People hold dollars not because they love America, but because there's nowhere else to safely entrust their assets. Nations continue to buy U.S. government bonds like addicts, both fearful and needy. And the calls for de-dollarization usually only echo in conferences without representatives from the IMF. Song Hongbing pointed out something few dared to say. The strongest currency is not the one with the greatest intrinsic value, but the one structured like a prison. You can enter easily, but it's hard to get out. You can use it to buy everything, but you can't use anything to replace it. And when you fall into debt with it, you don't pay with money. You pay with sovereignty, with policy, with the future of generations to come. In a world where every nation uses a currency it doesn't control, globalization is no longer a trend but a rigged game. Whoever prints money plays first. Whoever issues debt chooses the rules. The rest, no matter how hard they try, are just stand-in dealers. But the biggest question isn't who wins, but does this game ever end? The ironic truth lies in a still image. When central banks print money together like doctors prescribing stimulants to a heart failure patient, the patient's burst of euphoria is not recovery, but a signal of an impending cardiac arrest. The future he depicted is bloodless yet haunting. There are no guns and bullets, but every coin is a velvet-covered bullet. There are no large-scale wars, but each financial crisis leaves millions jobless, homeless, faithless, and unable to hold anyone accountable. Because that system has no center to blame. It is a financial spiderweb where every thread leads to the same place, but no one holds the end of a thread. Where you are sure someone is pulling the strings, but there's no hand to accuse.